There's been an incredible number of things happening in the news, haven't there? For example, there's been war. And over the world at the moment, there's been reports of 20 different ongoing wars at the moment. We probably hear about Ukraine and the one in Israel, but all around the world it's happening. Then the last couple of days we've been hearing about terrorism over in Moscow. And yet terrorism is happening all over the world as we speak in about 30 different countries. And every month, 30 different countries, terrorism happens. It's dreadful. And to cap it all, this week we've been hearing about famine. And famine possibly not just in Gaza, but across areas of Africa. And it's dreadful, isn't it? The suffering that people are going through, and often because of people's inhumanity to other people. Where do we go for our source of hope? How can we see the invisible hand of God in our world to give us that hope? Well, sadly, most of the sources of media that we turn to are no longer built on Christian values. The BBC, when that was started many years ago, had as its foundation biblical beliefs when it was all set up. Many of the newspapers were run by Christian editors, filled with Christian writers. But now, all of that has drifted the way of social media. It's gone very, very secular. We can't depend on those for our inspiration and our hope. How can we, as Christians, find news that will help us in the same way that the Christians who were in the early days of the church found it? And they were surrounded not by just secular, but by a whole Roman Empire that was trying to crush them out of existence. Where do we go so that we too see the world as God sees it, seeing people and the whole of creation from God's eyes? Because we need that so that we can then act and live through our Christian faith. Well, I'd like to this morning give you 3 examples of believers and how they saw God's invisible hand in the world, so that can give us some clues as to how to notice God's work in our world. Amidst all the pain and suffering, we can't wish that away, it's there. But how can we act and notice God at work alongside us, both in the greater world, in our nation, and in our own lives? The first person I want to look at is somebody we're familiar with in the Gospels, Luke. Now, Luke addresses in chapter 2 and verse 1 a very significant event that was happening at that time. The Caesar Augustus, called for an audit, a census of all the people in the known Roman Empire at that very moment. And Luke noted that in verse 1. But he doesn't just note it as a human history event. It's not just part of what Roman history was about. What Luke did was he linked it very carefully all the way down through to Israel and to the 2 people in his story, in his account, Joseph and Mary. And we need to be learning how to do that. Not to just see the array of news which often pulls us down, but to discern God's hand in it. One thing which Dave, where are you, Dave? There you are. Dave and I, we correspond on WhatsApp. And we both share Christian news to encourage one another. Dave's tapped into one of the American Christian channels, so I get all these wonderful things about the latest archaeological discoveries, Christians involved in politics, Christians involved in all sorts of ways, helping people in need. And I try and correspond back with my Instagram posts talking about Christians in athletics, Christians in the media. And so we're finding God in the midst of our world. Have we got somewhere where we go to to hear God's voice in the media, to encourage us. Luke managed to take a global event and find God in it. Now, there were two things that Luke particularly did. He talked to believers who'd experienced God in their life, not just theologians, they're important, but people who actually put God into practice, people living by faith. And then he heard their experience. On this occasion, it was Mary who inspires much of the early part of Luke's gospel. Have we got people who we talk to are experiencing God now, today? There's loads of Christian books we can buy which relate how God is speaking and acting in our world today. And it's happening right now. Every day, more than 65,000 people become Christians. Are we aware of that? Or do we just see the world through the Daily Telegraph and the Guardian? You know, we need to look beyond and find hope, because that's what we can survive by as Christians. The other thing which Dr. Luke did, which was really powerful, and it's definitely something which we can do to encourage us, is he reflected back on his life. He reflected back on what God was doing in the world. He did it through writing. We can all do that through things like journals and talking to one another and going back over what has happened in our life. I know Nicky Gumbel, what he does is when he prays, he doesn't just pray and forget it. He writes it in the corner of his Bible. And then when he goes back through the Bible the next year, because he reads the Bible once a year, he notes back and goes, that's what I prayed, and it came true in this way. Are we actually noting and reflecting on what God is already doing? Because if we just pray and forget, we won't see it. The second character that I want to draw us to isn't in the Bible, but was in recent history. Now, in 1915, during the Great War, Britain was faced with a problem. You see, we were getting a lot of our supplies from America to help us with the development of ammunition. Now, you'll know from recent events, Ukraine is hampered by not getting supplies, and it's having to stall its effort in its fight against Russia. Well, that was about to happen in the Great War. We had run out of a vital component of the mechanism that fired bullets out of their cartridges, acetone, which was coming from the product of maize in America. And the MPs got together and said, what are we going to do? Well, one of them, a young man, you might have heard of his name, Winston Churchill, he got all the chemistry professors together and he said, we need a substitute for what's going on in America. What are we going to have? Because the Germans are sticking their U-boats in the Atlantic and blowing up all the shipments coming across. What are we going to do? One of them said, I've got a substitute. It's conkers. Conkers are what we need. So, the government arranged for scouts and guides, for volunteers who weren't fighting the war, to go all over the country during the autumn and to bag up tons and tons of conkers, put them on the trains and ship them off to the professor in Manchester. And that professor took them, melted them down, whatever they do, the jiggery-pokery, and then extracted the acetone, sent it off to the Ministry of Defence. It was converted into a component of the vital ammunition. We didn't have to surrender. He was commended and was invited along to the Houses of Parliament, and the Prime Minister of the day spoke to him and said, you've saved Great Britain. You have saved the nation from having to surrender to the Germans. What would you like? You can have money. You can have a big estate. You can have a title. All three. What would you like? Well, the man, he was a very special man, you see. He was Jewish, a Jewish believer. And he said, I don't want any of those. What I would like is the promise of a homeland for my people. And so the following year, the Prime Minister and Lord Balfour drew up the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a promise for the homeland of the people. You see, the Professor Weizmann, he saw God's invisible hand at work in his life, and he took that opportunity to serve God. 30 years later, he became the first president of Israel, Professor Chaim Weizmann, a name worth remembering. He was willing to serve rather than have the money, the fame, the status. The third person I want to consider is somebody from the Palm Sunday story. I got there in the end. And Palm Sunday is being celebrated all over the world by 2.5 billion Christians. Not 2,500 like the time of Paul and the apostles. 2.5 billion, and we're still miserable and saying, woe is me. Oh, dreadful the news. We need to get hope built back into our hearts. So, I want to look at just one event from the events all around Palm Sunday. And it's one involving Mary anointing Jesus. It took place at Simon the leper's house. And she did something rather extraordinary. She saw the invisible plan of God being worked out before her eyes. None of the other disciples noticed this. What was it that was the key to her seeing God's hand through Jesus during that week? Well, let's go back a few days to the death of Lazarus. Mary, like Martha, had wept when her brother died, washed his body, taken out the alabaster jar, poured the nard out and rubbed it into his body to make sure it was preserved as long as it could, then wrapped the body in the linen cloths and then sealed the tomb. And she'd wept and wept broken-hearted for days until Jesus arrived. And then it all changed. Out walks the man that she'd anointed for death. And it must have profoundly struck her. Most of us, when somebody dies, that's it. And we live with the grief for years. Some people live with it until the day they die. But Mary, it was like, what? And the surprise and the shock and the joy at seeing Lazarus must have still remained with her for days. But can you imagine what that was like for her to then think about Lazarus and what Jesus was saying about going to Jerusalem, dying and being raised again in 3 days? Perhaps she, of all the people, understood what was about to happen because of her suffering, her pain, and her joy. Sometimes when we go through deeply emotional experiences, that breaks our heart. But in a broken heart, somehow God then opens us up in a deeper way to experience something of a revelation of God. And I wonder if Mary actually had that revelation. The problem with revelation, deep revelation, is not everybody gets it. And when Mary anointed Jesus in the home of Simon, the other disciples didn't like it. So be prepared. If you're somebody that sees God's invisible hand, other people might get annoyed, especially other Christians who have other things going on in their minds and hearts. So I'd like to take us back just to look at those three people again. Luke saw God's hand in history and was able to link what goes on in government all the way down to individuals. We need to ask God to do that so that we don't get overwhelmed by the bad news, but recognize God's news of hope in our world. Luke reflected using the method of writing, and there's lots of ways that we can do that. Chaim Weissman, he noticed the invisible hand of God in his life through his work. And sometimes our secular work will open up opportunities for us. Look for them. All sorts of things can happen in our life, and we think it's just work, but God has bigger plans for us. And finally, even in our suffering, we can get a deeper revelation of who God is that helps us to perceive God's work in our life and the life of those around us even more keenly.